5 starving orphans, a ruthless land baron hunting them down, and a solitary, battle-scarred cowboy who swore he'd never lift a gun again. When 21-year-old Clara Bennett collapsed on Elias Thorne's porch after walking 14 miles through a Montana hellscape, she thought she was just begging for a meal. She didn't know she was starting a war. How far will a broken man go to protect a desperate woman who has nothing left to lose? Stick around, because this is a story of survival, sacrifice, and a marriage of convenience that changes everything. Today's journey reminds us of one beautiful truth. Real family isn't always defined by the blood in your veins, but by the people who courageously choose to stand between you and the storm. If this story touches your heart, drop a comment below to let us know which moment moved you the most, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
The Montana sun in August wasn't just hot. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of heat that baked the earth into cracked pottery and turned the air into a shimmering, breathless haze. Out on the Thorne Ranch, 20 miles from the nearest town, the silence was usually absolute. Elias Thorne preferred it that way. He sat in the dim coolness of his cabin, a rag in one hand and his disassembled Winchester rifle spread across the scarred oak table in front of him. At 32, Elias had carved a life out of isolation. The jagged, pale scar that slashed from his left cheekbone down to his jawline was a permanent reminder of the war that had hollowed him out, and the silence of the plains was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. He didn't want company. He didn't invite guests. Then the sound came. Knock, knock, knock. Elias's hands went completely still. The rag hovered over the oiled barrel of the rifle. The knocks weren't the frantic pounding of a panicked traveler, nor the heavy-handed thud of a lawman. They were deliberate, rhythmic, measured. He didn't move for a long moment, listening to the agonizing creak of the porch planks baking in the sun. Slowly, with the ingrained caution of a man who had survived hell by never assuming he was safe, Elias set the rag down. He reached to his hip, drawing the heavy Colt revolver from its holster. His boots made no sound as he crossed the room. He paused at the heavy oak door, thumb resting on the gun's hammer, and pulled the latch back. The door swung outward, and a blinding wall of midday light spilled into the cabin, thick with dancing dust motes. Elias narrowed his cold, slate-gray eyes against the glare, expecting a drifter, a rustler, or a lost cowboy. Instead, he found phantoms. 5 figures stood on his porch, swaying in the brutal heat like wheat caught in a dry wind. For a second, Elias thought the sun had finally melted his mind. They were coated in a thick layer of red Montana dust, their clothes little more than ragged, sun-bleached patches held together by fraying thread. His gaze snapped to the one at the front. She wasn't a child, though the desperate thinness of her frame might have suggested otherwise at first glance. She was a woman, 21, maybe 22. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, escaping from a frayed ribbon and sticking to her sweat-streaked neck. The fabric of her faded calico dress hung loosely over a body that had been starved of sustenance. But beneath the dirt and exhaustion, Elias could see the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw and the proud slope of her shoulders. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin burned red from the unforgiving sun. Yet it was her eyes that stopped the breath in Elias's lungs. They were a striking, vivid hazel, and they were entirely devoid of fear. There was no pleading in them, no pathetic begging. They were anchored to his scarred face with an iron-willed defiance that Elias had only ever seen in the eyes of soldiers who knew they were making their final stand. Behind her huddled 4 children. A boy of about 12, his jaw set in a tragic mimicry of the woman's defiance, though his knees trembled. Twin girls no older than 8, clinging to each other's tattered skirts like frightened birds. And leaning against the woman's leg was the smallest, a little boy of perhaps 5, his eyes half closed, his face terrifyingly pale beneath the grime. Elias stood in the doorway, a towering, broad-shouldered mountain of a man. His Colt still gripped in his right hand. He didn't say a word. He let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch, waiting for the inevitable sob story. Clara Bennett forced her chin up. Her throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. Every instinct screamed at her to collapse, to let the darkness pulling at the edges of her vision take her. She had walked 14 miles through a scorched hellscape, driven by nothing but the desperate need to keep the 4 souls behind her breathing. She looked at the giant of a man filling the doorframe. He looked dangerous. His face was a hard mask of weathered bronze, marred by a brutal scar, and his eyes were as welcoming as a winter storm. She didn't care. He was their last chance. "We have no one left," Clara croaked. Her voice was a dry rasp, but she refused to let it break. She stared straight into his imposing, terrifying gaze, forcing herself to stand tall despite the fact that her boots had worn completely through to the blistering soles. "Our parents are dead. We have nowhere else to go." Elias felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. He had expected beggars. He hadn't expected a battlefield commander trapped in the body of a starving woman. Before he could form a reply, the fragile truce with gravity broke. A tiny, pathetic sound, like the exhale of a dying breath, came from the dirt-caked boy at her side. Little Sam's eyes rolled back in his head. His legs simply gave out, folding beneath him like snapped twigs. He didn't just fall. He tipped forward, a dead weight pitching over the edge of the threshold. "Sam!" The iron facade shattered. Clara lunged forward, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror tearing from her throat. But her own legs were too weak, her reflexes dulled by days of starvation. She missed him. Elias moved. Decades of honed battlefield instincts took over. The Colt was shoved back into its holster in a blur of motion. Elias dropped to one knee on the hard wooden planks, his massive hands shooting out to catch the child before his head could strike the porch. The boy weighed nothing. He was a terrifying bundle of sharp bones and feverish heat, light as a bundle of dry kindling. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands hovering over her brother's face, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. The fierce, defiant woman from a second ago vanished, replaced by a sister drowning in the unbearable agony of failing the only family she had left. A single tear tracked a clean line through the dust on her cheek. "Please," she whispered, the word fracturing in the heavy air. Her hazel eyes flew up to meet Elias's, and the raw vulnerability in them hit him harder than a physical blow. "Please, he's only 5. Elias looked down at the boy in his arms, then up at the 3 terrified children huddled on the steps, and finally at the woman kneeling in the dirt at his feet. He had spent the last 5 years building a fortress to keep the world out. He had sworn to never be responsible for another human life, not after the blood he had on his hands. But looking at Clara Bennett, Elias felt the thick, impenetrable walls around his heart violently crack. He shifted his grip, scooping the unconscious boy up against his broad chest as easily as if holding a feather. He stood to his full height, casting a long protective shadow over Clara. The ice in his veins was gone, replaced by a sudden, fiercely burning fire. "Get up," Elias commanded. It wasn't a threat. It was a low, gravelly rumble of absolute authority. Clara blinked, disoriented, her hands still shaking. Elias stepped back, opening the heavy oak door as wide as it would go. He looked down at the beautiful broken woman, his jaw locking with a sudden, unshakable resolve. "Get inside," Elias vowed, his gray eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. "All of you. I won't let you suffer. Not on my land." The interior of Elias Thorne's cabin was a stark contrast to the blazing inferno outside. It was dim, smelling of wood smoke, oiled leather, and dried sage. It was the sanctuary of a man who required nothing but the barest essentials to exist. That absolute quiet was instantly shattered by the chaotic, desperate presence of 5 starving strangers. Elias didn't hesitate. He carried little Sam to the only bed in the room, a sturdy, heavy timber frame tucked in the corner, and laid the boy down on the wool blanket. He didn't ask Clara for permission. He just moved with the terrifying, efficient precision of a soldier who had spent years triaging the dying. "Leo!" Elias barked, his gravelly voice cutting through the heavy air. The 12-year-old boy jumped, his eyes wide. "Pump at the back door. Fetch a bucket of water. Now!" Leo didn't argue. He scrambled out the back. Elias was already at the cast-iron stove, shoving kindling into the belly and striking a match. He moved fast, grabbing a heavy iron pot, tossing in a generous portion of rolled oats, dried apples, and a thick chunk of salted pork to boil. It wasn't a feast, but rich food would only make their shrunken stomachs rebel. They needed warmth and sustenance, fast. Clara stood frozen near the door, her arms wrapped defensively around the trembling twins, Lily and Rose. She watched Elias with a mixture of profound relief and ingrained suspicion. Men didn't just help without a price, especially not men who looked like they had been forged in violence. "Sit them down at the table," Elias ordered without looking back, stirring the pot as the water began to boil. Clara ushered the girls to the rough-hewn oak table. Leo returned, lugging a wooden bucket of water that sloshed over the sides. Elias took a tin cup, dipped it, and handed it to Clara. "Small sips," he warned, his gray eyes catching hers in the dim light. "Or they'll bring it right back up." For the next half hour, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the stove and the frantic scrape of tin spoons against wooden bowls. Leo ate like a starved wolf, though he tried valiantly to slow down when Elias shot him a warning look. The twins ate with both hands, tears of pure relief leaving clean tracks down their dusty cheeks. Elias had managed to wake Sam just enough to feed him a few spoonfuls of warm, salty broth before the boy slipped back into an exhausted, healing sleep. Through it all, Clara hadn't touched her bowl. She sat at the end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching her siblings eat with a fierce, hawk-like intensity. Her bowl of oats sat steaming, untouched, right in front of her. Elias leaned against the counter, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He watched her. She was swaying slightly in her chair, her face ashen, her cracked lips parted as she breathed shallowly. "Eat," he commanded quietly. Clara didn't look at him. "Not until I know they have enough. If they want more..." "There's half a pot left on the stove," Elias interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, brooking no argument. He pushed off the counter, covering the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped right beside her chair. He was so large, he seemed to block out the rest of the room. Clara finally looked up at him, her hazel eyes flaring with that same stubborn, defensive fire. "I'm fine. I can wait." "You're a stiff breeze away from passing out on my floor," Elias said flatly. He reached down, his large, deeply calloused hand wrapping around the warm wooden bowl. He slid it directly under her chin. "I'm not in the habit of digging graves for people who are too proud to eat. Pick up the spoon, Clara." The use of her name, which she vaguely realized Leo must have muttered at some point, sent a strange shiver down her spine. It sounded heavy and rough on his tongue. She stared at the scarred cowboy, searching for mockery or a hidden agenda. She found neither, just a brutal, unwavering honesty. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Clara picked up the spoon. The first bite tasted like heaven itself. She closed her eyes, a soft, involuntary sound escaping her throat. Elias watched her throat work as she swallowed, something tight and dangerous coiling in his gut. He turned away abruptly, stepping out onto the porch to give them the dignity of eating in peace, and to give himself a moment to breathe. By midnight, the cabin was silent again. Elias had laid down his spare bedrolls and horse blankets near the hearth. The 4 children were tangled together in a deep, immovable sleep. Clara had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled into a tight ball on the braided rug nearest to Sam's cot, her arm thrown protectively over her little brother's chest. Elias sat at the oak table, an oil lamp burning low, casting flickering shadows over his scarred face. He was nursing a cup of black coffee, trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do tomorrow. He was a solitary rancher. He didn't know the first thing about children, let alone a fiercely beautiful, sharp-tongued woman who looked ready to fight a grizzly bear with her bare hands. His gaze drifted to the corner where Clara's meager belongings lay in a pitiful pile. A canvas rucksack, completely worn through at the seams, had slumped over. As it fell, a thick, folded piece of parchment slid out, landing stark white against the dark floorboards. Elias wouldn't have invaded her privacy, but the handwriting on the exposed face of the envelope caught the lamplight. His breath hitched. He set the tin cup down so hard, coffee sloshed over the rim. He stood, crossed the room silently, and picked up the envelope. To Elias Thorne, Stone Ridge Ranch, Montana Territory. The script was elegant, disciplined, and instantly recognizable. It was the handwriting of a man who had written military dispatches under heavy artillery fire in the Shenandoah Valley, Arthur Bennett. Elias's chest seized. The memories buried under 5 years of whiskey and isolation clawed their way to the surface. The blood in the mud, the agonizing burn of the rebel bullet shattering his ribs. Arthur dragging him by the collar of his uniform through a hail of lead, screaming at him to stay awake. Arthur, who had shared his meager rations, his bandages, his hope. With a thumb that wasn't entirely steady, Elias broke the wax seal. He unfolded the parchment. Elias, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and my Clara has found you. I have no right to ask this of you, my friend, but you are the only man on this earth I trust. The sickness took my wife, and now it is taking me. But the fever is not what threatens my children. My brother, Silas Vance, is hunting them. He knows about the Bitterroot deed. He knows what lies beneath the land, and he will not stop until he has the children to legitimize his claim. Silas is a ruthless man, Elias. He uses the law as a shield and violence as his sword. Clara will try to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She will not ask for help. But Silas has men, and he has money. Protect my girls. Protect my boys. Protect my Clara. Yours in life and death, Arthur. Elias stared at the signature until the letters blurred. The silence of the cabin pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. Silas Vance. The name was known even out here in the deep country. A wealthy, ruthless land baron operating out of Helena. A man who bought up deeds and destroyed anyone who wouldn't sell. Elias crumpled the edge of the letter in his fist. He had come to Montana to escape war. Now Arthur's ghost had just delivered one straight to his doorstep. You weren't supposed to see that yet. Elias turned. Clara was awake. She was sitting up on her pallet, the blanket clutched to her chest. In the dim lamplight, she looked impossibly fragile, but her hazel eyes were entirely lucid and fiercely guarded. She pushed herself up, wincing as her stiff, blistered feet took her weight, and walked over to the table. She reached out, her small, pale hand resting on the edge of the parchment. "My father said you owed him a debt," Clara said, her voice a low, raspy whisper to avoid waking the children. "He told me to find you, that you were a good man." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "But he was dying, and he was desperate. I know what I'm asking. I know who Silas is." "Do you?" Elias asked, his voice a dangerous rumble. "I know he poisoned our water well in Missouri," she said, the horrifying truth slipping out before she could stop it. "I know he bribed the local sheriff to ignore it. I know he won't stop until he has us, or until we're dead." Clara pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around her waist, a defensive barrier against the towering cowboy. "We only needed a place to rest, Mr. Thorne, just for a few days to get Sam's strength back. We are leaving at the end of the week. I will not bring my uncle's violence to your door. You've done enough just feeding us." Elias stared at her. The sheer, magnificent foolishness of her pride made him want to shake her. "Leaving," Elias repeated, the word tasting like ash. He stepped closer to her, invading her space. Clara instinctively took a half-step back until her spine hit the heavy timber of the cabin wall. Elias didn't stop until he was inches from her. He looked down into her wide, startled eyes. He could smell the dust and dried sweat on her, but beneath it, the faint, sweet scent of wild lavender. "You think you can outrun Silas Vance and a posse of hired guns on foot?" Elias asked softly, his voice a lethal rasp. "With a 12-year-old boy and a 5-year-old who can't even stand?" "I'll figure it out," Clara shot back, lifting her chin, refusing to be cowed by his size. "I have so far." "You walked to my door and collapsed," Elias corrected brutally. He lifted his hand. For a second, Clara flinched, expecting anger. Instead, Elias's rough knuckles gently grazed the side of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to her heart. "Arthur pulled me out of a ditch when I was bleeding out," Elias said, his eyes darkening to the color of a storm-swept sky. The touch of his hand was a stark contrast to the violence in his words. "He gave me a second chance at life. You are his blood." Clara swallowed hard, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was trapped between the solid wall behind her and the overwhelming heat of the man in front of her. "Mr. Thorne." "Elias," he corrected. He dropped his hand, but he didn't step back. The air between them crackled, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with fear. "You aren't leaving at the end of the week, Clara. You aren't leaving at all." "I won't be a burden." "You aren't a burden," Elias interrupted, his jaw setting into a hard, immovable line. He picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and slid it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "You brought a war to my doorstep, Clara Bennett. But it's my war now. You and those kids are under my protection. And God help the man who tries to step onto my land to take you." 3 days passed, and the silence of the Thorne Ranch was entirely upended. It wasn't that the children were loud. They were, in fact, terrifyingly quiet at first, still bruised by the trauma of their journey. It was the sheer presence of them. The cabin suddenly felt entirely too small. There were small boots lined up by the door, twin girls huddled by the hearth, and a 12-year-old boy following Elias around the yard like a shadow. And then there was Clara. If Elias was a man carved from stone, Clara Bennett was a woman forged in a furnace. She refused to sit still. The moment the blisters on her feet began to scab over, she took over the cabin. She found his meager supplies and somehow stretched them, baking hardtack into edible biscuits and mending his torn work shirts with a needle and thread she'd salvaged from her rucksack. Elias stood in the doorway of the barn, a worn leather bridle in his hands, watching her. She was out by the water pump, a heavy wooden washboard set into a tin tub. The brutal midday sun beat down on her, turning the loose strands of her dark hair to spun copper. She was scrubbing one of his flannel shirts with a bar of harsh lye soap. Her knuckles were raw, her face flushed with the heat, but the rhythmic, punishing scrape of the fabric against the board didn't slow. Elias tossed the bridle over a stall door, his jaw tight. He crossed the dusty yard, his long strides eating up the distance. "Stop," he said. Clara jumped, the lye soap slipping from her wet fingers and splashing into the suds. She hadn't heard him approach. Elias was a massive man, but he moved with the unsettling silence of a hunting cougar. She swiped a soapy forearm across her brow, leaving a streak of white foam on her flushed skin. "It's nearly done, Mr. Thorne. I just need to rinse it." "I told you to call me Elias," he rumbled, stepping close enough that his broad chest blocked the sun, casting her in his cool shadow. He looked down at her hands. The skin around her knuckles was cracked and bleeding, the lye eating into the blisters she'd earned on the trail. Something hot and irrational flared in his chest. Without asking permission, he reached out, his large, calloused hands closing gently over her wet wrists. He pulled her hands out of the water. Clara gasped, her breath catching in her throat. His hands were impossibly warm, rough like sandpaper, but incredibly careful. A jolt of electricity shot up her arms, settling low in her stomach. She looked up, her hazel eyes wide, colliding with his intense, slate-gray stare. "You aren't a hired hand, Clara," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. "You don't need to bleed to earn your keep here." "I have to do something," she whispered fiercely, trying to pull her wrists back, though he held them firm. "You're feeding 5 extra mouths. You're harboring us. I won't be a charity case." "It's not charity, it's protection," Elias corrected, his thumb inadvertently brushing against her frantic pulse point. He felt the rapid, fluttering beat of her heart against his skin, and the realization that she was profoundly aware of his touch made the air between them suddenly thick and difficult to breathe. Before Clara could form a rebuttal, the sharp, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves shattered the moment. Elias released her wrists instantly, his entire demeanor changing. The gentle protector vanished, replaced in a split second by the hardened veteran. His right hand dropped to the worn grip of the Colt at his hip. He stepped in front of Clara, shielding her body with his own as he turned his gaze toward the long dirt road leading to the ranch. 3 riders were cutting through the heat haze, kicking up a massive plume of red dust. Clara peered around Elias's broad shoulder, her blood running ice cold. "Silas," she breathed, the name a curse on her lips. The riders slowed as they crossed onto thorn land. Flanking the center rider were 2 hard-looking men with dust-colored dusters and rifles resting too casually across their saddle horns. Hired guns. But it was the man in the middle who made Clara's stomach violently heave. Silas Vance looked entirely out of place in the unforgiving Montana wild, yet he carried himself as if he owned the very dirt beneath their boots. He wore a tailored dark charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silver pocket watch chain gleaming in the sun. At 50, his hair was heavily silvered, his face lined but handsome in a sharp, predatory way. He pulled his sleek black gelding to a halt a few yards from the porch. Silas's eyes swept over the modest cabin, the sparse yard, and finally settled on the towering, scarred man standing in front of his niece. "Clara, my dear," Silas said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and coated in a sickly sweetness that made Clara want to retch. "I have been beside myself with worry. When I heard Arthur had passed, I rode out immediately. And to find you here, in this squalor." Elias didn't move an inch. "You're trespassing on Stone Ridge land, Vance. State your business or turn that horse around." Silas's eyes shifted to Elias, lingering on the brutal scar traversing his face. A smile, thin and devoid of warmth, touched his lips. "You must be Elias Thorne. I've heard the whispers in town, the hermit of the valley, a man with a colorful military record." "Last warning," Elias said, his thumb easing the hammer of the Colt back with a sinister, audible click. The 2 hired guns tensed, but Silas raised a gloved hand to stop them. He wasn't a fool. He knew a killer when he saw one. He dismounted smoothly, brushing the dust from his lapels, projecting an aura of total legal authority. "There's no need for hostility, Mr. Thorne. I am a man of the law, not an outlaw," Silas said smoothly, taking a few steps closer. He looked past Elias, locking his predatory gaze on Clara. "I've come for my family. Arthur was a foolish man to drag these children out here, but I am their blood. I am their rightful guardian." "Arthur's letter says otherwise," Clara snapped, stepping out from behind Elias's shadow. She was shaking, but she kept her chin high. "He knew what you did to the well in Missouri. He knew what you were after. You don't care about us, Silas. You care about the deed." Silas sighed, a deeply patronizing sound. "Grief has clouded your mind, Clara. Your father was delirious at the end. I am here to rescue you." He paused, his eyes sweeping over her wet dress, her bare arms, and the proximity to the scarred rancher. His smile turned wicked. "Though I must say, the town of Helena is already buzzing with a rather unsavory rumor," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried perfectly across the yard. "A 21-year-old unmarried woman living under the roof of a solitary violent man, sleeping under his roof, unchaperoned." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Think of the children's morals, Clara," Silas pressed, striking exactly where he knew it would inflict the most damage. "What kind of environment is this for impressionable young girls? What kind of woman does that make you in the eyes of the law?" "Shut your mouth," Elias growled, stepping forward, his massive frame radiating pure, lethal intent. Silas didn't flinch. He simply reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of official-looking parchment. "You can shoot me, Mr. Thorne, but you can't shoot the territorial magistrate. The law does not look kindly upon spinsters living in sin, especially when minor children are involved. The judge and Helena is already drawing up the papers." Silas looked directly into Clara's horrified hazel eyes. "By Friday, the sheriff will ride out here. The orphanage in Billings will take the twins and the little boy. Leo is old enough for the workhouses, and I, as their only blood relative, will be granted conservatorship over Arthur's estate to pay for their care." Clara couldn't breathe. The yard tilted crazily. Silas wasn't going to use bullets. He was going to use society reputation and the gavel to rip her family apart. He was going to turn her desperate bid for survival into a scandal that would ruin them all. "I'm not an unreasonable man, Clara," Silas said, placing a foot in the stirrup and swinging back onto his horse. He looked down at her with cold triumph. "I'll give you 48 hours to pack your things and bring the children to the hotel in town peacefully. Spare them the trauma of being dragged away by deputies." Silas tipped his expensive hat to Elias. "Good day, Mr. Thorne. I suggest you don't interfere with territorial law." He turned his horse, his men following suit, and the three of them rode away, leaving a suffocating cloud of dust in their wake. Clara stood frozen, the harsh lye soap burning the cuts on her hands, though she couldn't feel the pain. The silence of the ranch rushed back in, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. She had failed. Despite the 14 miles, despite the starvation, despite Elias's protection, Silas had won. The orphanage, the workhouses, the very things she had sworn on her mother's grave to protect them from. "I have to pack," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. A ragged, desperate sob tore from her throat as she turned blindly toward the cabin. "I have to pack their things. If we leave tonight, maybe we can make it to the rail station." Elias caught her arm, spinning her gently back around. "Let me go!" Clara cried out, hitting his solid chest with her free hand, a frantic, helpless strike. "He'll take them, Elias. The sheriff will come, and he'll take them because of me, because I'm a woman and I'm living here, and they'll say I'm—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the societal shame of it choking her. Elias didn't let her go. He gripped both her upper arms, holding her steady, absorbing her panic like a stone breakwater absorbing a hurricane. He looked down at her tear-streaked, devastated face, his own expression stripped of all its gruffness, leaving only a fierce, immovable resolve. "Silas needs a scandal to take the kids," Elias said, his voice a deep, steady rumble that vibrated against her palms where they pressed into his chest. "He needs you to be an unmarried woman living with a stranger to make his legal claim hold water." Clara looked up at him, her chest heaving, her hazel eyes swimming with tears. "I am an unmarried woman. The judge will sign the papers." Elias's jaw tightened. He stepped into her space, his towering presence completely enveloping her, a terrifying, beautiful shield against the entire world. "No, he won't," Elias vowed softly, his gray eyes blazing with a dangerous, brilliant fire. "Because there's one way to make the law choke on its own words." Clara stared at him, her breath hitching. "How?" "By Friday," Elias said, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before rising back to her eyes. "You won't be an unmarried woman living with a stranger. You'll be my wife." The word hung in the stifling, soapy air between them, heavy and absolute. Wife. Clara stopped breathing. She stared at Elias, her hazel eyes wide, searching his scarred, impassive face for any sign that this was a cruel joke. He didn't blink. He didn't waver. He stood before her like a mountain that had just decided to alter the course of a river. "You can't be serious," Clara finally whispered, the words scraping past the lump in her throat. She took a step back, her wet hands curling into fists at her sides. Marriage? Elias, you don't even know me. You took us in out of pity, out of a debt to my father. You can't chain yourself to a stranger and 5 orphans just to spite Silas. It's not about spite, Elias said, his voice a low, pragmatic rumble that offered no room for argument. It's about the law. Silas is a snake, but he's a snake who knows how to use a courtroom. His entire petition for guardianship hinges on your compromised virtue. The law won't let an unmarried woman of 21 raise minor children under a bachelor's roof. He closed the distance she had put between them, his presence overwhelming but strangely grounding. We remove the bachelor. We remove the compromised virtue. A territorial judge will laugh Silas out of the county if he tries to strip children away from a legally married couple who own a working, deeded ranch. Clara shook her head, a chaotic storm of pride and desperation warring in her chest. It's a trap for you. Silas won't stop. If you put your name on paper with mine, you're making yourself his primary target. Elias's jaw locked. A dark, lethal shadow passed over his gray eyes, the look of a man who had stared down enemy cannons and lived to tell the tale. Let him try. I'm not afraid of Silas Vance. But I can't ask you to throw your life away for— You didn't ask, Elias interrupted, his tone final. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a stray fleck of lye soap from her cheek. The touch was startlingly tender for a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. I offered. It's a piece of paper, Clara. A tactical maneuver. It gives you my name, my protection, and a legal wall Silas can't climb over. That's it. Clara looked at the cabin, then at the barn where her siblings were huddled, their lives hanging by a thread thinner than spun glass. She thought of Sam's pale face, of the workhouses Silas had threatened Leo with. Her pride was a small, worthless thing to sacrifice if it meant keeping them safe. She swallowed her pride, the taste bitter and metallic on her tongue. All right, Clara said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. All right, we'll do it. By dawn the next morning, the stark reality of what they were doing set in. There was no white lace, no nervously excited bridesmaids, no bouquet of wildflowers. Clara washed herself in the tin tub with cold water and pumice, scrubbing away the trail dirt until her skin was raw. She donned her only clean garment, a faded blue calico dress that had been mended at the elbows and hem. She tried to pin her dark hair up neatly, but a few rebellious curls escaped, framing a face that was far too pale save for the dark smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes. When she stepped out onto the porch, Elias was waiting. Clara's breath hitched. She had only ever seen him in dusty work clothes and worn leather. Today, he wore a dark charcoal suit that looked as though it had spent 5 years locked in a cedar chest. It stretched tight across his massive shoulders, emphasizing the sheer raw power of his frame. A clean white shirt collar rested against his tan throat, and a black Stetson was pulled low over his eyes. He looked respectable, dangerous, and devastatingly handsome. He didn't offer a compliment, but his gray eyes swept over her, darkening with an unspoken intensity that made a flush creep up Clara's neck. "Leo," Elias called out. The 12-year-old stepped onto the porch. Elias handed him the heavy Winchester rifle. Leo's eyes widened, his small hands gripping the oiled wood. "Keep the door barred," Elias instructed, his voice grave. "Don't open it for anyone but us. If riders come, you fire a warning shot into the dirt. If they don't turn around, you shoot to kill. Do you understand me, son?" Leo swallowed hard, standing a little taller. "Yes, sir." Elias nodded, trusting the boy. He turned to Clara and offered his arm. "Let's go." The wagon ride into the county seat was agonizingly silent. The heat rose from the plains in shimmering waves, baking the leather of the buckboard seat. Clara sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the horizon. Every bump in the road felt like a step closer to the gallows. She was binding herself to a killer, to a hermit, to a stranger. Yet, as she glanced sideways at Elias's strong, scarred profile, She couldn't deny the profound sense of safety that radiated from him. The town of Blackwood was a bustling, dusty hub of cattlemen, miners, and merchants. When Elias Thorne pulled his wagon onto the main thoroughfare, heads turned. The hermit of Stone Ridge rarely came to town, and he certainly never came dressed in a suit, accompanied by a beautiful young woman. Elias ignored the stares, tying the horses at the hitching post outside the territorial magistrate's office. Before Clara could step down, his large hands spanned her waist, lifting her effortlessly from the wagon and setting her on the wooden boardwalk. His grip lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Chin up," Elias murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "You're a thorn now. Let them stare." He guided her into the dim, paper-stuffed office of Magistrate Higgins. Higgins, a balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened at the sight of Elias, then darted suspiciously to Clara. "Thorne," Higgins said cautiously. "What brings you to town?" "A wedding," Elias stated flatly. "Draw up the papers." Higgins blinked, adjusting his spectacles. He looked at Clara, noting her faded dress, the bruised, lie-burned knuckles, and the sheer tension radiating from her stiff spine. "A wedding, Elias, this isn't a cattle transaction. The girl looks like she's marching to a firing squad. Miss, are you here of your own free will?" Elias's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. He took a half-step forward, his massive frame suddenly dominating the small room. But Clara moved first. She stepped slightly in front of Elias, meeting the magistrate's judgmental gaze with eyes full of hazel fire. "My name is Clara Bennett, and I am marrying Mr. Thorne because there is no man I trust more in this territory. Draw up the papers, magistrate. We have a ranch to get back to." Higgins recoiled slightly from her fierce tone. He cleared his throat, pulling a fresh sheet of heavy parchment from his drawer. "Very well. Names." The ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted less than 5 minutes. It was cold, clinical, and stripped of all romance. Higgins recited the legal bindings in a monotone drone. The scratch of the fountain pen echoed loudly in the quiet room as Clara signed away her independence, her name, and her future. "The ring?" Higgins asked, looking up. Clara froze. They hadn't discussed a ring. It was a fake marriage, a tactical maneuver. Why would there be a ring? But Elias reached into his dark vest pocket. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out a simple, unadorned silver band. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but it gleamed with a quiet, solid strength in the dusty light of the office. He turned to Clara. He reached out and took her left hand. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her hands were a disaster, calloused from the trail, cracked from the sun, and raw from the lie's soap. She tried to pull back, suddenly deeply ashamed of her battered skin. But Elias's grip was firm. He didn't look at her injuries with disgust. He looked at them with a profound, terrifying reverence. His large, rough thumb stroked over her bruised knuckles, a painfully gentle caress that sent a shockwave of heat straight to her core. Elias locked his gray eyes onto hers as he slid the cool silver over her knuckle. It was a perfect fit. "With this ring," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp that was entirely unscripted, "I vow to protect you, from this day until my last." Clara stared up at him, her heart slamming against her ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He was looking at her not as a tactical maneuver, but as a man making a blood oath. "I pronounce you man and wife," Higgins finalized, stamping the parchment with the territorial seal. "You may kiss the bride." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's eyes widened. Elias looked down at her. He didn't cross the boundary they had silently drawn, but he lifted his hand, his knuckles brushing the soft skin of her cheek in a fleeting, burning touch. "We're done here," Elias said to the magistrate. He picked up the marriage certificate, folded it into his coat, and offered Clara his arm. Stepping back out into the blinding Montana sun, Clara looked down at the heavy silver band resting on her left hand. The metal was already warming against her skin. She was Clara Thorne now, legally bound, owned by the law, protected by the man walking beside her. As they climbed back into the wagon, Elias didn't immediately take the reins. He looked at her, his eyes stripping away the tough exterior she wore like armor. "Silas has no claim now," Elias said quietly. "The kids are safe." Clara looked at the silver ring, then up at the scarred, solitary man who had just sacrificed his hard-won peace to build a fortress around her family. For the first time since her parents died, the crushing weight on her chest eased, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling new tension. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. He simply nodded, snapping the reins over the horses' backs. The wagon rolled out of town, kicking up a trail of dust toward Stone Ridge. The tactical maneuver was complete, but as the miles passed in heavy, charged silence, Clara realized with a sinking, fluttering heart that the hardest part wasn't fighting Silas Vance. The hardest part was going to be surviving the slow-burning fire of living as Elias Thorne's wife. The first 3 days of the marriage were a study in agonizing, suffocating proximity. Before the ink on the magistrate's parchment was even dry, the boundaries between them had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer a reluctant savior and a desperate refugee. They were man and wife. Under the law, they were one entity, and the small, one-room cabin suddenly felt as though it had shrunk to half its size. Every movement became a negotiation of space. If Clara was at the cast-iron stove, Elias had to brush past her skirts to reach the coffee pot. If Elias was cleaning his boots by the hearth, Clara could feel the heat radiating from his broad shoulders every time she turned around. The silver band on her left hand felt impossibly heavy, catching the lamplight and serving as a constant glaring reminder of the vow he had made. Yet, despite the tension vibrating like a plucked fiddle string, a strange, undeniable domesticity began to take root. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara stood on the porch, a bowl of shelled peas in her lap, watching Elias and Leo near the corral. Elias had pulled out a smaller, lighter repeating rifle from his lockbox. He stood behind the 12-year-old boy, adjusting Leo's stance with a quiet, infinite patience that made Clara's chest ache. Elias's massive, scarred hands guided Leo's small ones, showing him how to sight down the barrel without flinching. "Breathe in," Elias's deep voice carried across the dusty yard. "Hold it. Don't pull the trigger, son. Squeeze it, like you're holding a bird you don't want to crush." The rifle cracked. A tin can 30 yards away spun into the dirt. Leo let out a whoop of pure joy, his face lighting up. Elias didn't smile. Clara wasn't sure the man knew how. But a profound softness touched the corners of his slate-gray eyes as he ruffled the boy's hair. He was giving Leo the tools to survive, stepping into a void Arthur Bennett had left behind. Later that evening, the tension finally snapped into sharp physical focus. Elias ducked through the doorway, bringing the scent of pine, leather, and hard work into the cabin. A jagged tear ripped through the shoulder of his flannel shirt, exposing a slice of tanned, muscled skin and a shallow, bleeding scratch beneath it. He had caught himself on a rogue strand of barbed wire while repairing the north fence. Clara set down her mending basket immediately. "You're bleeding." "It's a scratch," Elias grunted, heading for the wash basin. "Sit down," Clara ordered. The authoritative tone slipped out before she could catch it. The voice of a sister who had managed 4 unruly children on a grueling trail. Elias stopped. He turned his head, looking at her with a raised, scarred brow. For a second, Clara thought he might refuse, but he simply pulled out a wooden chair and sat, his long legs stretching out across the floorboards. Clara grabbed a clean rag, dipped it in warm water, and stepped directly into his space. Standing between his parted knees, she was suddenly acutely aware of how massive he was. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady rhythms. She dabbed the blood away from the scratch. Elias didn't flinch, though a muscle in his jaw feathered. "The shirt is ruined if I don't catch the tear now," Clara murmured, her voice sounding entirely too breathless in the quiet cabin. She reached for her needle and thread. "Don't move." "You don't have to mend it while it's on my back, Clara," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that she felt all the way down to her toes. "If you take it off, the tear will widen," she lied, her fingers trembling slightly as she threaded the needle. In truth, she wasn't sure she could handle seeing him entirely shirtless. She leaned in. To stitch the fabric, her knuckles had to rest directly against his chest. The heat of his skin bled through the flannel, searing her. With every meticulous stitch, the back of her hand brushed the hard, defining muscles of his chest. She could feel the heavy, thundering beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. It was racing. Elias sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He was staring straight ahead, but his gaze was locked on the pale, graceful curve of her neck. He smelled the wild lavender soap she had used, mingling with the scent of fresh baked bread. Clara tied off the thread and bit the end, her face mere inches from his. She looked down, her hazel eyes colliding with his storm-gray stare. The air vanished from the room. Neither of them moved. Elias's gaze dropped to her parted, slightly swollen lips. The primal, overwhelming urge to pull her into his lap and taste her crashed over him like a tidal wave. Clara swayed closer, her breath hitching, drawn by an invisible magnetic gravity. A log popped violently in the hearth. They jerked apart as if they had been burned. Clara spun away, clutching her needle to her chest, her face burning. Elias stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. He grabbed his Stetson and walked out into the cool evening air without a word, leaving Clara trembling in the center of the room. By midnight, the fragile peace Clara had built shattered. It wasn't a sound that woke her, but a terrifying, suffocating silence. With the legal threat of Silas neutralized and the children sleeping soundly, Clara's body finally realized the war was paused, and with the safety came the ghosts. She lay on her pallet in the dark, her eyes wide open. Suddenly, she wasn't in a safe cabin in Montana. She was back in the oppressive, humid heat of Missouri. She could hear her mother's feverish, rattling breaths. She could feel the dead weight of her father's hand as it slipped from her grip for the final time. She saw the raw, open dirt of their unmarked graves. "I'm alone. They're gone. They're all gone." Her chest seized. A band of iron wrapped around her ribs, pulling tighter and tighter until she couldn't draw a breath. She sat up, clutching her throat, her mouth opening in a silent, desperate gasp for air. The cabin walls seemed to lean inward, crushing her. Panic, cold and absolute, swallowed her whole. She scrambled off the pallet, terrified of waking the children, and stumbled blindly toward the door. She threw the heavy latch and practically fell out onto the porch. The vast, starry Montana sky offered no comfort. It was too big, too empty. Clara dropped to her knees on the rough wooden planks, her hands gripping the porch railing. She was hyperventilating, short, ragged gasps tearing from her throat. Tears blinded her. The dam she had built to survive the last 2 months finally, catastrophically broke. The door creaked open behind her. Elias had been sleeping lightly on a bedroll near the hearth. He stepped out into the biting night air, clad only in his canvas trousers, his chest bare and marked by a web of pale, brutal scars. He saw her collapsed against the railing, shaking violently, gasping for air that wouldn't come. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He crossed the porch in 2 strides and dropped to his knees beside her. "Clara," Elias said. She couldn't answer. She squeezed her eyes shut, drowning in the panic. Elias reached out and pulled her directly into his chest. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his massive, heavily muscled arms around her trembling frame, burying her face against the bare skin of his shoulder. He trapped her flailing hands between them, holding her with a crushing, absolute solidity. "Listen to me," Elias rumbled. his voice a deep, vibrating anchor in the center of her storm. He pressed her ear flat against his chest. "Listen to my heart, Clara. Just listen to it." Beneath the scarred skin, his heart beat with a slow, powerful, unshakable rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. "You're here," Elias whispered fiercely into her hair, his large hand stroking down her rigid spine. "You're not in Missouri. You're in Montana. The kids are asleep. Silas is gone. You're safe. I've got you. I've got you." Clara clung to him. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his trousers, gripping him as if he were the only thing keeping her from spinning off the edge of the earth. She focused on the heavy, thundering beat of his heart. She matched her ragged breaths to the rise and fall of his chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the iron band around her ribs loosened. The panic retreated, leaving behind an ocean of raw, devastating grief. Clara broke. A gut-wrenching sob tore from her throat, burying itself in Elias's shoulder. She wept for her mother, for her father, for the childhood she had been forced to abandon. She cried until her throat was raw and her body felt hollowed out. Elias never let go. He held her through the storm, his chin resting on the top of her head, his embrace an impenetrable fortress against the dark. When the tears finally subsided into exhausted hiccups, Clara didn't pull away. She kept her face pressed to his chest, the warmth of his skin seeping into her frozen bones. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "I'm so sorry. I'm supposed to be strong for them." "You are the strongest goddamn woman I have ever met," Elias said, his voice thick with an emotion he had thought died in the war. He pulled back just enough to frame her tear-streaked face in his large, calloused hands. His thumbs gently wiped the moisture from her cheeks. "But you don't have to be strong every second, not with me. Let me carry it, Clara." She looked up at him. In the pale moonlight, the brutal scar on his face didn't make him look monstrous. It made him look like a man who knew exactly what it cost to survive. He was staring at her lips, his eyes dark and hungry and impossibly tender. The air between them thickened, the lingering adrenaline of the panic attack shifting instantly into a desperate, visceral need to feel alive. Clara didn't think. She simply closed the distance. She pressed her lips to his. Elias groaned, a deep, guttural sound of surrender. His hands slid from her cheeks, tangling in her loose, dark hair, anchoring her to him. He took over the kiss, parting her lips with a desperate, crushing intensity. It wasn't sweet, and it wasn't gentle. It was a collision of two broken, starving souls finding a lifeline in the dark. He tasted like coffee, night air, and pure, intoxicating male heat. Clara's hands slid up his chest, her fingertips tracing the raised scars, pulling him closer until there wasn't a fraction of an inch between them. She opened her mouth to him, matching his fierce, demanding rhythm, her heart pounding a frantic counterbeat to his own. Elias wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her effortlessly against him, his mouth devouring hers with a possessive, ravenous hunger that had been building since the moment she collapsed on his porch. For 5 years, Elias had been a dead man walking. But right now, with Clara trembling in his arms and tasting like tears and salvation, he had never felt so violently, desperately alive. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads rested together. Elias's chest heaved. He looked down at the woman in his arms, his wife in name and now, irrevocably, his wife in spirit. "Clara," Elias breathed, a rough, ragged confession in the dark. She didn't speak. She just buried her face in the crook of his neck, her hands clutching his broad shoulders, and let the Montana night envelop them. The fake marriage was over. The real fire had just been lit, and there was no power on earth that could put it out. The morning sun did not bring relief to the Thorn Ranch. It brought a blistering, blinding reality. Clara woke to the smell of brewing coffee and the empty space on the bedroll near the hearth. Elias was already gone. She sat up, pulling the wool blanket to her chest, her fingers lightly grazing her lower lip. It was slightly bruised, a tender physical reminder of the desperate, consuming fire that had ignited between them in the dark. The silver band on her left hand felt different today. It no longer felt like a cold tactical maneuver. It felt like a brand. She dressed quickly, braiding her hair to keep it off her neck in the oppressive heat, and stepped out onto the porch. The yard was quiet, too quiet. Leo was usually mucking out the stalls by now, and the twins should have been chasing the barn cat. Instead, Leo came sprinting around the side of the barn, his face entirely drained of color. He was gasping for air, his boots kicking up clouds of red dust. "Clara!" Leo shouted, his voice cracking. "It's Elias! He told me to stay back, but... The North Creek, Clara! Something's wrong!" Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't ask questions. She ran back inside, grabbed her father's heavy Winchester rifle from the corner, and sprinted toward the barn. She didn't bother saddling the gentle buckskin mare Elias let her ride. She just grabbed a fistful of mane, swung herself onto the horse's bare back, and kicked her heels into its flanks. The ride to the North Creek took less than 10 minutes, but every second stretched into an agonizing eternity. As she cleared the ridge overlooking the water source that kept the Thorn Ranch alive, the smell hit her first. It was the thick, metallic stench of fresh blood, baking rapidly in the morning sun. Down in the creek bed, the water wasn't running clear. It was muddied and stained a sickly, rusted crimson. Two of Elias's prime steers lay dead in the shallows, their throats slashed deep and clean. Up on the bank, a massive stretch of barbed wire fencing had been methodically snipped to pieces, curling in the dirt like dead iron snakes. This wasn't a rustler's work. Rustlers stole cattle. This was a message. This was destruction for the sheer joy of it. Elias was standing in the center of the carnage. Clara pulled the mare to a halt and slid off, the Winchester gripped tightly in her hands. "Elias!" He didn't turn around. Clara took a step forward, her boots crunching on the dry grass, and stopped. Something was terribly wrong. Elias was standing rigid, his massive shoulders locked tight. His Colt was drawn, gripped so fiercely in his right hand that his knuckles were bone white. He was aiming the heavy revolver at a thicket of empty alder bushes on the opposite bank. His breathing was harsh, erratic, and loud enough that Clara could hear it over the buzzing of the greenbottle flies gathering on the carcasses. "Elias?" Clara called out again, her voice softer this time, laced with sudden dread. He didn't register her. His slate-gray eyes were blown wide, pupils dilated until they swallowed the iris. He wasn't looking at the Montana Creek. He was looking at a blood-soaked trench in Virginia. He could smell the cordite, hear the deafening roar of the cannons, and see the rebel uniforms advancing through the smoke. The metallic stench of the slaughtered cattle had ripped the heavy iron door off the darkest vault in his mind. "Hold the line," Elias muttered, a ragged, guttural sound that chilled Clara to the bone. He cocked the hammer of the Colt. "Hold the damn line." He was going to shoot at shadows. He was lost in the war. Clara dropped the Winchester. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. She didn't run. Running might trigger a reflex, but she walked forward with steady, deliberate steps, putting herself directly in his line of peripheral vision. "Elias," she said clearly, keeping her tone completely even, devoid of the panic screaming in her head. He flinched, the barrel of the Colt swinging wildly toward her. Clara froze, staring down the dark, lethal bore of the revolver. Her heart stopped, but she forced herself not to step back. She looked past the weapon, locking her hazel eyes onto his terrified, unseeing gaze. "You're in Montana," Clara said, her voice ringing with absolute, unwavering authority. "The war is over, Elias. You are on Stone Ridge." He blinked, a bead of sweat tracing the jagged scar on his cheek. His breathing hitched, but the gun didn't lower. Clara took another step forward, closing the distance until the barrel of the Colt was inches from her chest. If his finger twitched, she was dead. But she remembered the crushing, protective weight of his arms around her the night before. She remembered the steady beat of his heart. She reached out, moving agonizingly slow. and wrapped her small, warm hands over his massive, trembling one. "Look at me," she commanded softly. "Look at my face." Elias's chest heaved. He stared at her, the fog of a decade-old nightmare fighting against the vivid, sharp reality of the woman standing before him. He felt the silver band on her left hand press against his knuckles. He smelled wild lavender and dust. "Clara," he choked out, the word tearing out of his throat like barbed wire. "I'm here," she whispered fiercely. With gentle, unrelenting pressure, she pushed his hand down until the Colt was pointed at the dirt. "You're with me. Silas did this, not the rebels. Silas Vance." Elias shuddered violently, a massive tremor racking his powerful frame. The glaze of the past shattered, leaving him entirely in the present. He looked down at the gun in his hand, then at the blood in the water, and finally at Clara, who had just walked down the barrel of a loaded weapon to pull him back from hell. A profound, sickening wave of shame washed over him. He uncocked the revolver and shoved it into his holster, taking a massive step back, putting distance between them. "You shouldn't have done that," Elias rasped, turning his face away, unable to meet her eyes. "I could have pulled the trigger. When my head goes, I don't see what's in front of me." Clara didn't let him retreat. She stepped right back into his space, grabbing the lapels of his dusty vest and forcing him to look down at her. "But you didn't," she said fiercely, her eyes blazing. "You didn't. You held me together last night, Elias Thorne. Don't you dare try to push me away when it's your turn to need an anchor." Elias stared down at her. The breath knocked completely out of his lungs. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever looked at his broken pieces and refused to run. The fierce, terrifying loyalty in her face cemented something deep in his chest, a lock turning on a vault that would never open for anyone else. He let out a long, shaky breath, his hands coming up to cover hers where they gripped his vest. "I'm all right," he murmured, the truth of it settling into his bones. "I'm here." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with the weight of the sabotage surrounding them. The line had been crossed. Silas wasn't using the law anymore. He was trying to starve them out, to terrorize them into breaking. Elias finally stepped back, his expression hardening back into the lethal, calculating rancher. He walked over to the severed fence line, crouching in the dirt to examine the clean cuts on the wire. "Heavy bolt cutters," Elias assessed, his voice completely steady now. "3 sets of horse tracks. They did it before dawn." Clara picked up her rifle, her jaw set tight. "He's trying to ruin you. Because of us. Because you married me to stop his guardianship claim." "It's more than that," Elias said slowly, his brow furrowing. He stood up, following the line of the fence toward the thick brush. He kicked at a pile of rocks that looked out of place. The toe of his boot unearthed a heavy wooden stake, driven deep into the soil. Elias reached down and yanked it out of the ground. Tied to the top was a faded, weather-beaten red ribbon. Stamped into the pale wood in faded black ink were 3 letters: PRR. Clara walked over, her eyes narrowing at the stake. "What is that?" "Pacific Railroad," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He turned the stake over in his hands, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly slamming together with sickening clarity. "They've been surveying the territory for the last 2 years, looking for the best route through the mountains. I threw them off my land last spring." "But my father's land," Clara started, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "The Bitterroot deed." "It sits right in the middle of the only viable pass," Elias finished, his gray eyes darkening. "If the railroad has to blast through the granite to the north, it'll cost them a fortune and 10 years of labor. If they go through Arthur's Valley, it's a straight shot." Clara stared at the blood in the creek, Silas's threats echoing in her mind. "I am here to rescue you. I am your rightful guardian." "It was never about us," Clara whispered, a cold, terrifying fury replacing her fear. He didn't care about my mother dying or my father. He just wanted the deed. The railroad will pay a fortune for that right-of-way. And Silas can't sell it unless he's the legal guardian of Arthur's heirs, Elias concluded, tossing the surveyor's stake into the dirt. Your father knew. That's why Silas poisoned your well in Missouri. He was trying to kill Arthur so he could swoop in and claim you kids before anyone asked questions. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal made Clara dizzy. Her own uncle had essentially murdered her parents for a train route, and now he was slaughtering Elias's livelihood to punish him for getting in the way. He's not going to stop, Clara said, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the Winchester. He can't afford to stop now. There's too much money on the line. Elias looked at the dead cattle, the ruined water supply, and finally at his wife. The fake marriage had just plunged them into a very real, very deadly war with a man who had limitless resources and zero morals. But as Elias looked at Clara, standing tall in the brutal heat, a rifle in her hands and a fire in her hazel eyes that matched his own, he knew Silas Vance had made a fatal miscalculation. Silas thought he was dealing with a desperate girl and a broken hermit. He didn't realize he had just forged them into a weapon. No, he's not going to stop, Elias agreed, his voice a low, lethal promise. He stepped close to Clara, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of absolute, unbreakable partnership. But neither are we. Let's go home and load the guns. They prepared for a gunfight. Silas Vance brought a piece of paper instead. 2 days after the massacre at the North Creek, the dust cloud that appeared on the horizon didn't belong to a posse of hired guns. It belonged to a lone rider wearing the tin star of a county deputy. He didn't dismount when he reached the thorn yard, keeping a nervous eye on the Winchester rifle resting casually in the crook of Elias's arm. The deputy handed down a sealed legal summons. "Judge Decker's in Blackwood, Thorn," the deputy said, his horse dancing nervously under him. "He's calling an emergency hearing regarding the guardianship of the Bennett miners. You and the missus are ordered to appear tomorrow morning. Bring the kids." Elias took the paper, his jaw locking. "Higgins is the magistrate. Who the hell is Decker?" "Territorial circuit judge," the deputy replied, tipping his hat to Clara, who stood on the porch with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Brought in special from Helena. See you tomorrow, Thorn." As the deputy rode away, Clara felt the familiar suffocating grip of panic tighten around her chest. Silas hadn't retreated after his sabotage. He had simply realized that bullets would be met with bullets. So, he had bought himself a judge. The Blackwood courthouse was a stifling, wood-paneled room that smelled of stale sweat, cheap cigars, and floor wax. Ceiling fans lazily pushed the hot August air in circles, doing nothing to cut the oppressive heat. Elias sat on a hard wooden bench, his massive frame rigid in his charcoal suit. Clara sat perfectly straight beside him, her hands tightly clutching her reticule. Leo and the younger children were seated on the bench behind them, terrified by the severe, quiet atmosphere. Across the aisle, Silas Vance looked immaculate in a tailored navy suit. He didn't look like a man who had ordered cattle slaughtered or a well poisoned. He looked like a grieving, concerned uncle. Judge Decker banged his heavy wooden gavel. He was an older man with a bulbous nose and shrewd, calculating eyes that barely looked at Elias or Clara. He looked entirely at Silas. "This court is in session to review the emergency petition filed by Mr. Silas Vance," Decker droned, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Vance claims that the sudden marriage between Elias Thorne and Clara Bennett is a fraudulent union, orchestrated solely to circumvent territorial guardianship laws and harbor kidnapped minors." Clara stood up, her hazel eyes blazing. "They aren't kidnapped. They are my brothers and sisters, and I am their legal guardian." "Sit down, Mrs. Thorne," Decker snapped, slamming the gavel. "You will speak when spoken to." Elias's hand clamped down on Clara's wrist, gently but firmly pulling her back onto the bench. He could feel the fine tremor of rage shaking her entire body. "Play the game," his touch silently communicated. "Don't give them an excuse." Silas's lawyer, A slick man with a waxed mustache stepped forward. "Your Honor, we submit that this marriage is a sham. A 21-year-old girl, traumatized by the death of her parents, arrives in a strange territory and is immediately coerced into a hasty, uncelebrated marriage by a hermit 10 years her senior." The lawyer turned, pointing a dramatic finger at Elias. "And what kind of man is Elias Thorne? We have witness testimonies from Helena. He is a man who suffers from violent, unpredictable fits of wartime madness. Just 2 days ago, a deputy reported seeing him heavily armed, exhibiting severe paranoia on his property." Clara's blood ran cold. Silas had twisted the Creek sabotage. He had used Elias's PTSD, the very thing she had helped pull him out of, as a weapon in a court of law. "He was armed because Silas Vance's men slaughtered our cattle," Clara yelled, unable to hold it back. "Objection," the lawyer barked. "Baseless slander." "Sustained," Decker ruled immediately without even pretending to deliberate. He looked down his nose at Elias. "Mr. Thorne, do you deny that you suffer from ailments of the mind resulting from the war?" Elias sat perfectly still. If he lost his temper, if he showed even an ounce of the lethal violence simmering in his blood, he would validate their entire argument. He looked at Silas, memorizing the smug satisfaction on the man's face, and then looked at the judge. "I deny that I'm a danger to my wife or those children," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed in the quiet courtroom. "I provide for them. I protect them. The marriage is legal, stamped by the magistrate of this very town." Decker sighed, stacking his papers with a theatrical air of disappointment. "A piece of paper does not make a safe home," Decker declared. "Given the severe accusations regarding Mr. Thorne's mental stability and the highly suspicious timing of these nuptials, I cannot in good conscience leave these children in this environment while the matter is investigated." Clara's heart stopped. She reached blindly for Elias, her fingers tangling desperately in his sleeve. "I am ordering a temporary injunction," Decker continued, his gavel raised. "An investigator from Helena will review the validity of this marriage and Mr. Thorne's fitness. Until that investigation concludes in 2 weeks' time, Clara Thorne is to be separated from her husband. She will reside under court supervision at Mrs. Gable's boarding house in town. To prevent tampering with the investigation, Mr. Thorne is forbidden from making contact with her." "No," Clara breathed, the word a shattered whisper. "As for the minors," Decker looked at the terrified children, "they will remain at the Stone Ridge Ranch for the next 48 hours to pack their belongings, after which Mr. Vance is granted temporary oversight to transport them to the territorial orphanage pending the final ruling." Bang! The gavel fell. It sounded like a gunshot. Clara couldn't breathe. Silas had won. He had used his railroad money to buy a judge who had just legally dismantled their family with a few strikes of a wooden hammer. 2 deputies stepped forward immediately, moving toward Clara. Elias stood up. The sheer size and predatory grace of his movement made both deputies freeze in their tracks, their hands dropping to their holsters. The courtroom went dead silent. Silas took a nervous step backward. Elias could draw his Colt. He could kill Silas, the lawyer, and the corrupt judge before the deputies even cleared leather. The urge to do it, to bathe the room in blood to keep Clara safe, was a physical ache in his bones. But Clara's hand slid down his arm, her small, cold fingers lacing tightly through his. He looked down at her. Her hazel eyes were wide and swimming with tears, but she shook her head, a fraction of an inch. If he drew his gun, he would hang. Silas would get the kids, the land, and the railroad money, and Clara would be left with nothing but a grave. Elias forced his muscles to uncoil. He stepped back, allowing the deputies to approach his wife. The goodbye on the dusty street outside the boarding house was a torturous, agonizing affair. The sheriff stood 10 feet away, watching them with sympathetic but firm eyes. Clara stood on the wooden boardwalk, her small rucksack in her hands. The children were crying in the wagon, Leo trying valiantly to comfort the twins while fighting back his own tears. Elias stepped up onto the boardwalk. He didn't care who was watching. He reached out, his massive hands framing Clara's pale, tear-streaked face. 2 weeks, she whispered, a sob catching in her throat. He's going to take them in 2 days, Elias. He's going to take them. He's not taking anyone, Elias vowed, his voice a harsh, ragged rasp. His thumb stroked her cheekbones, his slate-gray eyes burning with a dark, terrifying promise. The agonizing proximity they had shared in the cabin, the stolen glances, the accidental touches, the desperate kiss in the dark, had built a fire that now felt like it was burning them alive from the inside out as they were forced apart. Clara leaned into his touch, her hands gripping his wrists. "What are we going to do?" Elias leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, he closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of wild lavender, branding it into his memory. "Let Silas think he won the legal fight." Elias breathed against her lips, his voice so low only she could hear it. "Let him get comfortable. I'm going to take the kids back to the ranch, and I'm going to prepare." Prepare for what? Elias opened his eyes. The pacifist was gone. The soldier was back, cold and absolute. "To end this," Elias whispered. He kissed her forehead, a hard, lingering brand of ownership and protection, before stepping back. "Stay inside the boarding house, Clara. Keep the door locked. I'm coming back for you." Elias turned, walked down the steps, and climbed into the wagon. He didn't look back as he drove the children out of Blackwood, leaving Clara standing alone on the boardwalk, a legal prisoner in a town bought and paid for by her uncle. From the balcony of the saloon across the street, Silas Vance watched the wagon roll out of town. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, a victorious smile stretching across his face. He had isolated the girl, and he had cornered the cowboy. The land would be his by the end of the week. But Silas Vance had never fought a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The 48 hours granted by Judge Decker were a lie. Silas Vance had no intention of waiting for the law to officially hand over the children. The law was slow, and Silas was a man who preferred the swift, brutal finality of a strike in the dark. It happened on the first night Clara was locked away in Blackwood. At Stone Ridge, Elias hadn't spent the evening packing the children's meager belongings into bags. He had spent it boarding up the lower windows and pacing the perimeter of the cabin like a caged panther. He knew Silas's type. The judge's ruling was just a smokescreen to separate Elias from his wife, leaving the ranch vulnerable. A little past midnight, the distraction came. A sudden, brilliant flare of orange illuminated the cracks in the boarded windows. Elias grabbed his Winchester, throwing the heavy oak door open to see the western hayrick engulfed in roaring flames. The fire was threatening to spread to the dry grass near the barn. "Leo!" Elias barked, tossing the boy a heavy iron crowbar. "Bar this door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Leo said, his voice trembling but his hands steady as he gripped the iron. Elias sprinted out into the yard, keeping low, his eyes scanning the tree line for snipers. He reached the water trough, grabbing buckets to douse the stray sparks jumping toward the barn roof. The heat of the fire was blistering, the smoke thick and choking. But as he threw the second bucket of water, a chilling realization hit him. The fire was too contained. It was built perfectly on top of the hay, not at the base where a man intending to burn down a ranch would start it. It was a decoy. The sound of shattering glass echoed from the rear of the cabin, followed instantly by the terrified, high-pitched scream of the twin girls. Elias dropped the bucket. His heart stopped, then restarted with a violent, terrifying surge of adrenaline. He abandoned the fire, sprinting back toward the cabin with a speed that defied his massive frame. He didn't knock. He hit the front door with his shoulder, the sheer force shattering the iron hinges and sending the heavy oak crashing inward. The cabin was in chaos. The back window had been smashed in. Leo was on the floor, bleeding from a nasty gash on his forehead where he had been struck with the butt of a rifle. But he was fiercely clutching the crowbar, trying to stand. Lily and Rose were huddled in the corner, sobbing hysterically. Elias's slate-gray eyes swept the room in a fraction of a second. The cot in the corner was empty. Sam was gone. They came through the window, Leo choked out, tears of frustration and pain streaming down his face. Two of them. They were too fast, Elias. I tried to hit them. I tried— Quiet, son. You did good. You kept the girls safe, Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of panic. It was a cold, terrifying calm, the voice of a commander who had just watched the enemy cross the line of no return. He walked to the shattered window. Nailed to the wooden frame with a hunting knife was a piece of crisp, expensive stationery. Elias pulled the knife free and read the elegant handwriting in the dim light of the hearth. The deed and the guardianship papers signed over to me by dawn. Bring them to the old Black Creek mining camp. Come alone, Thorne. If I see a badge or if you make me wait, the boy goes down the mine shaft. Elias crushed the paper in his massive fist. Silas had just made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he had cornered a solitary rancher. He didn't realize he had just woken up a ghost from the Shenandoah Valley. Elias walked to the foot of his heavy timber bed. He hauled it aside with one arm, revealing a false floorboard. He ripped the wood away and pulled out a long, heavy iron trunk. It was locked with a heavy brass padlock. For 5 years, Elias had sworn to never open it. He had buried his past in this box, praying the blood on his hands would eventually wash away. But as he looked at Leo's bleeding head and thought of little Sam terrified in the dark, the vow he had made to himself shattered, replaced entirely by the vow he had made to Clara. Elias raised his heavy boot and stomped down on the padlock. The brass snapped. He threw the lid open. The smell of gun oil and old leather filled the room. Inside lay the tools of a dead man. A custom-tooled gun belt holding 2 perfectly balanced Colt .45 revolvers, boxes of heavy ammunition, a Bowie knife with a staghorn hilt, and wrapped in oiled canvas, a modified Henry repeating rifle, capable of laying down devastating rapid fire. Elias stripped off his flannel shirt. He strapped the heavy leather holsters to his thighs, the familiar weight of the twin Colts settling against his hips like old friends. He slid the Bowie knife into his boot and racked the lever of the Henry rifle, the metallic clack-clack echoing like a death knell in the quiet cabin. The pacifist was dead. Elias loaded the remaining 3 children into the wagon. He drove them through the pitch-black night to Blackwood, pulling up to the back door of the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a decent man, outmaneuvered by the corrupt judge, but he wouldn't let harm come to the kids inside his own jail. Elias left them in a locked cell with the sheriff standing guard, a shotgun in his hands. Then Elias moved like a shadow through the quiet streets of Blackwood, heading straight for Mrs. Gable's boarding house. Clara was awake. She had been pacing her small second-story room for hours, staring out the window at the empty street, her silver wedding band digging into her palm as she clenched her fists. A sudden heavy thud sounded on the balcony outside her window. Clara gasped, backing away as the window slid silently upward. A massive dark figure stepped into the room. Before she could scream, a large, calloused hand clamped gently over her mouth. "It's me," a rough, familiar voice whispered. Clara's knees went weak. Elias dropped his hand, and she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest. The leather of his gun belt pressed cold against her waist, but the heat of his body was everything. "What are you doing here?" Clara breathed, her hands frantically gripping his vest. "If the judge finds out—" "The judge doesn't matter anymore, Clara," Elias said, his voice grave. He caught her shoulders, stepping back just enough to look her in the eyes. In the pale moonlight, he looked different, lethal. The twin Colts on his hips gleamed. Silas didn't wait. He sent men to the ranch. They took Sam. Clara stopped breathing. The world tilted crazily on its axis. "Sam?" she whispered, the name tearing out of her like a physical wound. "He took Sam? He's 5 years old, Elias. He's just a baby." "He took him for leverage. He wants the deed." Elias's thumb stroked her trembling shoulders. "The kids are safe with the sheriff. I'm riding to Black Creek. I came to tell you so you wouldn't wake up to an empty town tomorrow." "You came to tell me goodbye," Clara realized, her hazel eyes widening as she took in the sheer amount of weaponry strapped to his body. You're going to fight them alone. I am going to bring your brother back, Elias corrected, his jaw set in stone. He turned toward the window. Elias, stop! Clara grabbed his arm, her grip shockingly strong. Silas has hired guns. He's stationed at a mining camp. It's a fortress. You can't just walk in there. I don't plan on walking in. I plan on leaving them nothing but bodies, Elias stated, the cold military detachment in his voice sending a shiver down her spine. Clara looked at her husband. She saw the war in his eyes, the ghosts he was unleashing just to keep her family safe. He was willing to damn his own soul to hell to spare hers. She turned away, dropping to her knees beside her small rucksack. She threw it open and pulled out a long bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. She unwrapped it quickly, revealing her father's heavy Winchester rifle. She checked the chamber, her hands shaking but her movements precise. She grabbed a box of cartridges and shoved them into the pocket of her dress. Elias stepped forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. What the hell do you think you're doing? Clara stood up, gripping the rifle. Her hazel eyes met his storm-gray stare, burning with an unshakable, ferocious fire. He is my brother, Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that perfectly matched his own. And you are my husband. I am not sitting in a boarding house waiting to see which one of you comes back in a pine box. Clara, no. It's a bloodbath waiting to happen. Then we bleed together, Clara interrupted, stepping directly into his space, her chest brushing his. You told me to let you carry the weight. Well, I'm telling you that you don't get to carry this alone. We ride together, Elias, or you'll have to shoot me to keep me in this room. Elias stared down at her. He saw the sheer, magnificent defiance in her face, the absolute refusal to be a victim anymore. His chest tightened painfully, a profound, terrifying surge of love crashing through him. He didn't argue. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her in for a hard, bruising kiss that tasted of fear and absolute devotion. Stay close to me, Elias breathed against her lips. And when I tell you to shoot, you don't hesitate. I won't, Clara vowed. The Montana sky knew blood was coming. By the time Elias and Clara rode out of Blackwood, the weather had turned violently. The oppressive heat of the last 2 weeks suddenly broke, replaced by a massive, terrifying drop in pressure. The horizon turned a bruised, sickly purple, and a low, howling wind began to rip across the plains. A haboob, a massive wall of dust and dirt picked up from the parched earth, was rolling toward the Black Creek Canyon. Elias pushed the horses hard. He knew the old mining camp. It was a rotting collection of wooden sluices, a rusted ore crusher, and a 2-story foreman's office built directly into the side of the rocky gorge. It was a perfect place for an ambush. As they crested the ridge overlooking the canyon, the leading edge of the dust storm hit them. It was like riding into a brown blizzard. The air instantly turned thick and choking, the wind roaring so loudly in their ears that Elias had to lean close to Clara to be heard. "Tie the horses here," Elias shouted over the howling wind, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. Clara mirrored his actions, securing her horse to a scrub oak. The grit stung her eyes and clawed at her throat, but the storm was a gift. Visibility dropped to less than 30 yards. Silas's lookouts wouldn't be able to see them coming. Elias pulled the Henry rifle from its scabbard. He looked at Clara, his gray eyes piercing through the swirling dust. He pointed to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the foreman's office below. "Take the high ground," Elias ordered, his hand gripping her shoulder. "Keep your head down. If anyone comes out of that office holding a gun, you put them in the dirt. I'm going in for Sam." Clara nodded, her knuckles white on her Winchester. "Bring him out, Elias." Elias vanished into the storm like a ghost. Clara scrambled up the rocky incline, the wind trying to tear her off the ridge. She threw herself flat on her stomach behind a large boulder, wiping the dust from her eyes. Below her, the shadowy outlines of the rotting mining camp loomed in the swirling brown haze. Down in the canyon, Elias moved with terrifying, lethal precision. The wind howled, covering the sound of his boots on the gravel. He saw the glowing cherry of a cigarette in the dust, a guard stationed near the ore crusher. Elias didn't hesitate. He emerged from the storm directly behind the man. One massive arm clamped around the guard's throat, cutting off his air, while the staghorn Bowie knife found its mark. The man dropped silently into the dirt. Elias moved on. The front door of the foreman's office was guarded by two men holding shotguns, squinting into the driving dust. Elias didn't bother with stealth anymore. He stepped out from behind a rusted water tower 20 yards away. He leveled the Henry rifle, racking the lever and firing in a blur of motion. Crack, crack. The sound of the heavy rifle was muffled by the storm, but the impact was devastating. Both guards were thrown backward through the rotting double doors, their shotguns clattering to the porch. Up on the ridge, Clara flinched at the gunfire, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her cheek to the wooden stock of the Winchester, sighting down the barrel, sweeping the area around the office. A man burst out of a side shed, raising a pistol toward Elias's exposed back. Clara didn't think. She remembered Elias's voice in the yard with Leo. Squeeze it, like a bird you don't want to crush. She exhaled, centering the bead on the man's chest, and pulled the trigger. The Winchester roared. The recoil punched her shoulder, but down in the camp, the man spun violently and collapsed into the dust. Elias didn't even look back to see who had saved his life. He knew. He kicked the shattered doors of the office open and stepped inside, the twin Colts instantly drawn and leveled. The interior of the office was dark, the air thick with dust blowing through the broken windows. "That's far enough, Thorne." Elias froze. At the far end of the room, standing near a rusted iron safe, was Silas Vance. But Silas wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding 5-year-old Sam. The boy was crying silently, his face pale and smeared with dirt. Silas had his arm wrapped tight around the boy's chest, using him as a human shield. In Silas's free hand was a silver-plated derringer, pressed directly to the boy's temple. "Drop the guns, Thorne," Silas sneered, his tailored suit ruined by the dust, his eyes wide with desperate panic. "I heard my men go down. Drop them or I paint the wall with my nephew's brains." Elias's blood ran ice-cold. The twin Colts in his hands felt impossibly heavy. He had the speed to shoot Silas, but a derringer had a hair trigger. If Silas flinched as he died, Sam would die with him. "Let the boy go, Silas," Elias said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble of pure, unadulterated menace. "You take me instead. You want the deed, you have to kill me anyway. Let the kid walk out that door." "Drop the guns!" Silas screamed, his hands shaking. He pressed the barrel harder against Sam's head. The boy whimpered, his terrified eyes locking onto Elias. Elias slowly, agonizingly, began to lower his revolvers. Outside, the wind shrieked. Through the shattered window on the eastern wall, Clara had crawled her way down from the ridge. She was crouched on the rusted tin roof of the adjacent porch, her Winchester aimed through the broken glass directly at her uncle's back. But Silas was entirely hidden behind Sam. There was no clean shot at his body or his head. The only thing exposed was the arm holding the derringer to the boy's temple. It was an impossible target. 4 inches of flesh and bone, shifting constantly in the dim light, with a 5-year-old boy's life hanging in the balance. Clara's hands shook. She couldn't do it. If she missed, if she pulled the shot by half an inch, she would shoot her own brother. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her face. She lowered the rifle slightly. A sob caught in her throat. Inside, Elias saw the barrel of the Winchester gleam in the window. He saw Clara's silhouette. He saw her hesitate. Elias didn't look at the window. He locked his slate-gray eyes onto Silas, drawing the man's total attention. "You're a coward, Vance," Elias spat, his voice booming over the wind, a deliberate, aggressive distraction. "You poisoned a dying man. You hide behind a 5-year-old boy. You aren't going to pull that trigger. You don't have the spine for it." Silas's face contorted in rage. "Watch me," he snarled, shifting his stance, leaning his head slightly to the side to glare at Elias. In that split second, Silas's arm extended just an inch further away from Sam's head. Elias roared over the wind. "Clara now." Clara didn't hesitate. Her husband's absolute, unwavering faith in her echoed in his shout. She snapped the rifle up, exhaled the breath in her lungs, and squeezed the trigger. The glass of the window shattered outward. The bullet tore through the roaring dust storm and slammed directly into Silas Vance's right shoulder. Silas screamed, the impact spinning him violently. His grip on Sam failed, and the silver derringer dropped harmlessly to the floorboards. Elias moved faster than humanly possible. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, tackling Silas to the ground before the man could even reach for his fallen weapon. Elias pinned the older man to the rotting floor, his heavy knee crushing Silas's chest, the barrel of his Colt jammed directly between Silas's terrified eyes. The urge to pull the trigger was overwhelming. The ghosts of the war screamed in Elias's head, demanding blood for the terror this man had inflicted on his family. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it right here. One twitch, and Clara would never have to look over her shoulder again. "Elias!" Clara scrambled through the shattered window, dropping her rifle and throwing herself across the room. She didn't go to Silas. She fell to her knees, scooping Sam into her arms. The little boy buried his face in her neck, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara looked up, clutching her brother to her chest. She looked at Elias, straddling her uncle, the gun shaking in his hand with the sheer force of his rage. "Elias, look at me!" Clara cried out over the wind. Elias's chest heaved. He tore his gaze away from Silas and looked at his wife. He saw her holding the boy he had sworn to protect. He saw the tears, the dust, the fierce, magnificent love in her eyes. "It's over," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't let him make you a killer again. It's over." Elias stared at her. The violent, suffocating darkness that had lived in his chest for 5 years, slowly, miraculously, began to recede. He didn't need to be a killer anymore. He was a husband. He was a father. Elias slowly uncocked the Colt. He grabbed Silas by the collar of his ruined suit, hauling the bleeding, whimpering man to his feet. "The U.S. Marshal is in Blackwood," Elias growled, shoving Silas toward the door. "He's going to love hearing how you kidnapped a child for a railroad deed. You're going to hang, Silas, and you're going to do it legally." Elias turned back to Clara. He holstered his weapons and dropped to his knees in the dust beside her. He wrapped his massive arms around both Clara and Sam, burying his face in Clara's hair. Outside, the dust storm raged on, tearing the sky apart. But inside the ruined office, surrounded by the remnants of Silas Vance's empire, the Thorne family held on to each other, unbroken, undeniable, and entirely safe. The dust storm broke just as the heavy iron doors of the Blackwood jail clanged shut behind Silas Vance. The U.S. Marshal had taken one look at Silas's bleeding shoulder, the terrified 5-year-old boy clinging to Clara's neck, and the lethal, silent fury radiating from Elias Thorne, and hadn't asked a single unnecessary question. Silas was locked away, facing federal kidnapping and attempted murder charges. The Bitterroot deed was secure. The war was over. The ride back to Stone Ridge was a quiet one. The violent winds had passed, leaving behind a sky washed brilliantly clear in a cool, crisp night air. In the back of the wagon, Leo had an arm wrapped fiercely around Sam, while the twins slept in a tangled, exhausted heap against their older brother. On the buckboard seat, Clara leaned heavily against Elias's side. His massive arm was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, holding her flush against his chest as he drove the team with one hand. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The steady, thundering beat of his heart beneath her cheek said everything the English language couldn't. When they finally crossed the threshold of the cabin, the sheer weight of the last 24 hours crashed down on them. Elias carried the children to their beds, not bothering to wake them to change their dusty clothes. He tucked the heavy wool blankets around them, his large, scarred hands lingering for a gentle second on Sam's sleeping head. Clara stood by the hearth, lighting the oil lamp. The soft, golden glow pushed back the shadows, revealing the absolute exhaustion etched into her husband's face. During the scuffle in the mining office, a stray piece of splintered wood or shattered glass had sliced a shallow, jagged line across Elias's left bicep. tearing his shirt and leaving a streak of dried blood. "Sit," Clara murmured, her voice a soft, raspy whisper in the quiet cabin. Elias looked at her, then at the wooden chair she was pointing to. He didn't argue. He didn't. He unbuckled the heavy gun belt, the weight of his past, and let it drop to the floorboards with a heavy thud. He sat down, his long legs stretching out, his broad shoulders slumping just a fraction. Clara poured warm water from the stove kettle into a tin basin. She grabbed a clean rag and a bar of mild soap, stepping between his parted knees just as she had days ago. But the frantic, suffocating tension from before was gone, replaced by a deep, profound intimacy. She unbuttoned his ruined shirt, pushing the fabric off his broad shoulders. Elias watched her face intently. Her hazel eyes were focused, her touch incredibly gentle as she washed the dirt and dried blood away from the cut on his arm. "It's not deep," Clara whispered, her thumb lightly tracing the edge of the clean wound. "It won't even scar." "I've got enough of those already," Elias rumbled, his voice low and thick in the quiet room. Clara paused. She looked up from his arm, her eyes tracing the pale, jagged scar that slashed across his cheek, then dropping to the brutal marks of war that painted his chest. "They mean you survived," Clara said fiercely. She leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss directly to the scar on his cheek. "They mean you were strong enough to make it home to us." Elias's breath hitched. He reached up, his large hand burying itself in the loose, dark waves of her hair, holding her face inches from his. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, wiping away the last trace of mining dust. "Clara," he breathed, the word a reverent prayer. He let go of her, reaching into the pocket of his discarded coat draped over the back of the chair. He pulled out the folded, heavy parchment that Magistrate Higgins had stamped just days ago, their marriage certificate. Clara's heart did a strange, nervous flutter. "Elias?" Elias didn't look at her. He leaned forward, holding the crisp paper over the glowing embers in the hearth. "Elias, what are you doing?" Clara gasped, reaching out to stop him. "That's our legal protection. The guardianship—" "Silas is in a federal cell," Elias interrupted gently, catching her wrist with his free hand. "He's never seeing the outside of a prison again. The law knows what he did. You don't need a legal shield anymore, Clara. You're free." He let the paper slip from his fingers. The dry parchment hit the embers, caught instantly, and flared into a brilliant orange flame. In seconds, the marriage of convenience was nothing but white ash drifting up the chimney. Clara stared at the fire, her chest tightening painfully. The tactical maneuver was over. He was letting her go. She had spent the last 2 months fighting to keep her family together, and now the man who had become the very center of that family was burning the only thing that bound them. "You promised," Clara whispered, her voice breaking, a sudden terrifying tear slipping down her cheek. "You gave me this ring, Elias. You promised." Elias stood up. He didn't step back. He stepped directly into her, framing her devastated face with both of his massive, calloused hands. "I promised I wouldn't let you suffer," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, raw rasp that shook with the sheer force of his emotion. "That piece of paper was a tactic. It was built on fear and blackmail and desperation." He dropped slowly to one knee on the hard wooden floorboards, looking up into her wide, tear-filled hazel eyes. "I don't want a wife who married me to save her brother's life," Elias vowed, his slate-gray eyes burning with absolute, unwavering devotion. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the silver band still resting on her left hand. "I want a wife who chooses me, without Silas, without the law. Just me. A scarred, solitary rancher who didn't know he was dead until you knocked on his door and brought him back to life." Clara couldn't breathe. The tears flowed freely now, but the crushing weight in her chest vanished, replaced by a soaring, incandescent joy. "I choose you," Clara sobbed, dropping to her knees right there in front of him, her hands frantically gripping his face. I will always choose you, every day, for the rest of my life." Elias let out a ragged breath, the last shadow of his past breaking entirely. He pulled her flush against his chest, capturing her lips in a deep, soul-shattering kiss. It tasted of salt and survival, and a love so profound it anchored them both to the earth. They weren't phantoms anymore. They were home. 1 year later. The late September sun cast a warm golden glow over the rolling plains of the Stone Ridge Ranch. The oppressive heat of summer had broken, leaving the air crisp and smelling of sweetgrass and pine. Clara Thorne stood on the wraparound porch Elias had built that spring. She rested her hands on the swell of her belly, heavily pregnant and glowing with a deep, radiant health that had completely erased the starved, desperate girl who had arrived 14 months ago. She smiled, watching the chaos in the yard. Leo was sitting tall in the saddle of a young roan gelding, guiding the horse through the paces with a quiet, steady confidence he had learned directly from Elias. Near the barn, Lily and Rose were shrieking with laughter, sprinting through the tall grass with a very fat, very spoiled barn cat darting between their boots. And by the corral fence, 6-year-old Sam was sitting on the top rail, a miniature Stetson pulled low over his eyes, mimicking the exact posture of the massive man standing beside him. Elias was leaning against the fence, a piece of straw caught between his teeth, listening seriously to whatever grand tale Sam was spinning. The brutal scar on his face was still there, but the lethal, haunted coldness in his eyes had vanished entirely. He looked like a man who had conquered the world simply by deciding what part of it was worth keeping. Far to the north, echoing faintly over the mountain ridge, came the sharp, distant whistle of a steam locomotive. The Pacific Railroad had been forced to blast through the granite. They had offered Clara a fortune for the Bitterroot deed, but she and Elias had placed it into an ironclad trust for the children. Some things were worth more than railroad money. Elias pushed off the fence, patting Sam on the boot before turning and walking toward the cabin. He took the porch steps in 2 long strides, his eyes locking onto Clara. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his solid chest. His large hands covered hers where they rested over their unborn child. Elias pressed a warm kiss to the sensitive skin just beneath her ear. "He's kicking again," Elias murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her spine as a tiny foot thumped against his palm. "She," Clara corrected playfully, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "And she's impatient, just like her father." Elias chuckled, a low, rich sound that still felt like a miracle every time she heard it. He turned her gently in his arms, looking down into her bright hazel eyes. The silver band on her left hand gleamed in the Montana sunset, no longer a tactical shield, but a symbol of a promise kept. "We have no one left," Clara whispered, quoting the desperate words she had spoken on this very porch a lifetime ago. A soft, brilliant smile broke across her face as she looked out at her siblings and then up at her husband. "I was so wrong, Elias. We have everything." Elias leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a slow, impossibly tender kiss. "Yeah," Elias agreed softly, holding his entire world in his arms. "We do."